drank their blood. He didn't just kill. He didn't just mutilate. Richard Chase earned his name as the Vampire of Sacramento because when police finally caught him, they discovered the kind of truth that even seasoned homicide detectives struggled to stomach. He drained his victims of blood, and in some cases, he ate pieces of them. Imagine walking into a crime scene where the body is not just lifeless, but desecrated in ways that seemed ripped from a nightmare. Now here's the disturbing part. When investigators pieced together the timeline, they realized that Richard Chase had been spiraling toward this darkness for years, long before he ever touched his first victim. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? Tell me in the comments. And also tell us, have you ever heard of a killer so deranged, so obsessed, that he believed he had to drink blood to keep himself alive? Subscribe the channel and like the video if you did not do it yet, because once you hear his story, you'll never look at true crime the same way again. But the truth police uncovered was darker than anyone imagined. Richard Trenton Chase was born in 1950, and from the outside, his life didn't look much different than any other child growing up in mid-century America. But the seeds of a monster were planted early. As a boy, Chase was withdrawn, awkward, and already showing warning signs that would later make sense in hindsight. He was shy, he struggled to connect with others, and when he did, it often came out in disturbing ways. Like many infamous killers, he exhibited what psychologists later called the McDonald Triad, a chilling combination of behaviors: cruelty to animals, obsession with fire, and bedwetting well past an appropriate age. These weren't just random quirks. They were red flags waving in plain sight. But no one could have predicted how far this would go. His home life only made things worse. Chase's father was strict, sometimes abusive and emotionally distant. His mother suffered from her own mental health struggles. Their household was filled with tension, and Richard absorbed it like a sponge. He was terrified of punishment, yet desperate for attention. Over time, that fear and isolation began to fester, twisting into something darker. As he entered adolescence, Chase began displaying symptoms of mental illness that no one around him truly understood. He became paranoid, convinced that strange things were happening inside his own body. He told friends and later psychiatrists that he believed his heart would sometimes stop beating. He said he felt his blood was turning to powder. Think about that. How terrifying it must have been to live inside a mind so convinced of its own decay. But instead of seeking help or finding stability, Richard turned to self-medication. By the time he was a teenager, he was abusing drugs and alcohol heavily, numbing himself from reality while feeding his delusions. In high school, classmates saw him as odd, even disturbing. He wasn't violent yet, but he stood out. Girls avoided him. Friends drifted away. And soon he was utterly alone. The isolation only made his thoughts worse. He began to obsess over the idea that his body was failing, that something in his bloodstream was broken, and that the only cure might lie outside himself. This obsession with blood, the very thing that would later define him, was already taking root. By his early 20s, Richard Chase was unraveling. He moved out of his parents' home and tried to live with roommates, but it ended in disaster. They complained about his bizarre habits, walking around naked, blasting strange music, leaving raw animal parts in the refrigerator. Eventually, they kicked him out, unable to handle his behavior. Left to his own devices, Chase descended further. He began capturing small animals, rabbits, dogs, cats, and dissecting them. He believed that by consuming their blood, he could absorb their life force, repairing what he thought was wrong inside his own body. This wasn't experimentation. This was compulsion. He smeared blood on his face. He drank it. He convinced himself this was survival, not madness. And here's the chilling detail. People around him knew he was strange, but they didn't know the full extent of what he was doing. To outsiders, he was just another troubled young man in the 1970s, floating aimlessly through life. But inside his apartment, a ritual of horror was taking shape. Eventually, his behavior drew attention from the authorities. He was institutionalized for a time, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Doctors noted his obsession with blood, his fixation on bizarre health fears, his inability to separate reality from delusion. At one point, he was found injecting himself with animal blood, leading to severe illness. But despite these clear signs of danger, Richard Chase slipped through the cracks. He was released, deemed not an immediate threat. The system failed to recognize the ticking time bomb they were letting back into society. And once he was free, Chase's descent only accelerated. He became skeletal in appearance, gaunt from poor nutrition and heavy drug use. Neighbors saw him wandering aimlessly, muttering to himself, covered in dirt and grime. His eyes were sunken, his demeanor unsettling. Some described him as looking less like a man and more like a walking corpse. But beneath that hollow shell was a growing hunger, a belief that only blood could keep him alive. And soon it would no longer be animals that satisfied his craving. The stage was set. The Vampire of Sacramento was about to make his first move. But this was only the beginning. On December 29, 1977, Sacramento learned what Richard Chase was truly capable of. Until then, his violence had been confined to animals, hidden behind closed doors. But that winter day, he decided it was time to test his compulsion on human life. His first known victim was Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old man and a father of two. He wasn't someone who lived a risky life, wasn't involved in crime, wasn't doing anything that should have put him in harm's way. Ambrose was simply unloading groceries from his car with his wife. Then, in an instant, he collapsed. At first, she thought he had suffered a sudden heart attack. But when police examined the scene, they discovered the truth. Ambrose Griffin had been shot and killed by a random drive-by shooter. His wife reported seeing a rust-colored Chevrolet speeding away. Witnesses gave vague descriptions, but no one connected it to Richard Chase. Not yet. The randomness of the crime made it terrifying. Ambrose had no enemies. There was no motive. And that's exactly what made Richard so dangerous. He wasn't killing for money, revenge, or passion. He was killing because his delusions demanded it. For weeks, Chase remained under the radar. But the hunger inside him was growing. By January 1978, he was restless, unstable, and driven by paranoia that his blood was drying up. He needed more. He needed human blood. And that's when he escalated. Chase began stalking neighborhoods in Sacramento, walking door to door, checking doorknobs. He had a rule: if the door was locked, he would leave. But if the door was open, to him, it was an invitation. That detail still haunts investigators. How many lives may have been spared simply because someone remembered to lock their door? On January 23rd, he found one that wasn't locked. The home belonged to Teresa Wallen, a 22-year-old 3 months pregnant. Teresa's husband had just left for work. She was alone, doing housework, when Chase forced his way inside. What happened next is almost too horrific to describe. Chase shot Teresa once with the same pistol he had used to kill Ambrose Griffin. But it didn't end there. He dragged her body to the bedroom and began a ritualistic mutilation. He stabbed her repeatedly with a butcher knife, then used the knife to cut her open. Investigators later said the wounds were not just violent, they were methodical, as if he was searching for something inside her. He then committed acts of necrophilia, and most disturbing of all, he used a yogurt cup to drink her blood. Police would later find bloody rings of the cup left behind at the scene. When Teresa's husband returned home, he walked into a nightmare. His wife was gone, his unborn child was gone, and the brutality of the scene shocked even hardened detectives. But Richard Chase wasn't finished. If anything, this crime only ignited him further. Just 4 days later, on January 27, 1978, Chase struck again. This time, the horror was multiplied. The victims were the Miroth family. Evelyn Miroth, a 38-year-old mother, had invited a friend, 51-year-old Dan Meredith, over to help her run errands. Her 6-year-old son, Jason, was at home, as well as her 22-month-old nephew, David, whom she was babysitting. While they were going about an ordinary day, Richard Chase entered their home. Again, the door was unlocked. Again, he took it as permission. What followed was a bloodbath. Dan Meredith was shot first in the hallway as he tried to flee. He collapsed dead on the floor. 6-year-old Jason ran to his mother's bedroom in terror, but Chase followed and shot him twice in the head. Then he turned his attention to Evelyn. She was in the bath when he attacked. Chase shot her once in the head, killing her instantly. But that was only the beginning. What he did next cemented his name as the Vampire of Sacramento. Chase dragged Evelyn's body onto the bed and mutilated her in ways that defy comprehension. He stabbed her repeatedly, carved out organs, and drank her blood. He sodomized her corpse. He inserted objects into her wounds. The crime scene was described as one of the most grotesque ever documented in California. And then, in an act that horrified the entire city, Chase abducted 22-month-old David from his crib. By the time police pieced the events together, David was missing, and the details of what Chase had done to him were unspeakable. Neighbors reported seeing a strange man leaving the house carrying something wrapped in a blanket. That something was David. The city of Sacramento went into panic. Newspapers carried headlines warning of a sadistic killer on the loose. Parents locked their doors, kept their children inside. People checked their windows twice, 3 times at night. Police scrambled to put the pieces together, and the public began to ask, who could possibly do something this monstrous? But for Chase, this wasn't monstrous. This was survival. In his warped mind, he believed his blood was turning to dust, that his organs were failing, and that by drinking blood, he was replenishing himself. To him, this wasn't murder, it was medicine. Investigators worked quickly, but they had few leads. Then a break came. One of Chase's neighbors recalled his bizarre behavior, the constant smell of decay around his apartment, the way he wandered aimlessly, disheveled, muttering to himself. They described him as looking like a skeleton, with sunken eyes and yellowed skin. Suspicion grew, and soon, police had a name: Richard Chase. But before they moved in, they needed evidence. And what they would eventually find inside his home would shock even the most experienced officers. But this was only the beginning. When detectives finally began circling in on Richard Chase, Sacramento was paralyzed with fear. The sheer randomness of his killings was the most terrifying part. He didn't stalk his victims for weeks. He didn't choose people because of grudges or personal vendettas. He chose them because their doors were unlocked, because he needed blood, because they were unlucky enough to cross paths with a man whose mind was completely broken. Police had only fragments to work with. Eyewitnesses who saw a strange, gaunt man in the neighborhood, a vehicle description that matched the rust-colored Chevrolet connected to the Griffin shooting, and neighbors who whispered about Chase's erratic behavior. Still, it wasn't enough to move in. They needed something concrete. That break came in the form of a witness. A woman who lived near Evelyn Miroth told investigators she had seen a disheveled man leaving the area around the time of the murders. He looked dirty, smelled awful, and carried a bundle that she assumed was laundry. But when news broke that the Miroth home had been turned into a massacre and that a baby was missing, her memory of that bundle took on a horrifying new meaning. Detectives began digging into Richard Chase's background. They learned about his prior institutionalization, his bizarre fixation on blood, the complaints from his former roommates, and the trail of dead animals he had left behind. Every lead pointed to someone spiraling deeper and deeper into psychosis. When they ran his name, they found the registration for a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol, the same type of weapon used in the murders. T-Hat was enough to put him on the top of their suspect list. But what truly sealed it was a single phone call. A woman contacted police claiming Richard had showed up at her door after the murders. His appearance had terrified her. He was filthy, his clothes stained, and he carried around a box of bloody rags. He asked her for a ride, but she refused. The encounter was disturbing enough that she couldn't shake it from her mind. She told police, something is very wrong with him. Now detectives knew they had their man. On January 27, 1978, the same day as the Miroth murders, officers tracked Chase to his apartment. They knocked on his door. Silence. Inside, they could hear faint movement, but he refused to answer. Detectives decided to wait, knowing eventually he would have to leave. Hours passed. Then, finally, Richard Chase emerged, holding a box. The moment he stepped outside, police swarmed him. In the struggle, he dropped the box, and when officers opened it, they found rags soaked in fresh blood. They had him. But what they discovered inside his apartment was far worse than they had ever imagined. The smell hit them first, a stench so foul it turned their stomachs. The small apartment looked more like a slaughterhouse than a home. On the counter sat blenders caked with a reddish-brown residue. When tested, it turned out to be blood and pieces of organs. The refrigerator contained animal parts and human remains wrapped in foil. On the floor were newspapers stained with blood, used as makeshift bedding. Blood smeared the walls, pooled in bowls, and coated kitchen utensils. Detectives would later say it was one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever encountered. But the most chilling discovery came when they searched for the missing baby, 22-month-old David. In a box on the back porch, they found his tiny body. Chase had mutilated him, removing parts of his organs, and left what remained discarded as if he were nothing more than garbage. Even seasoned homicide detectives broke down at the sight. The press erupted. The city of Sacramento was horrified beyond words. Newspapers ran screaming headlines, "Vampire killer captured." Details leaked to the public about how Chase not only killed his victims, but drank their blood and consumed their flesh. People were terrified that such a man had been roaming freely through their neighborhoods, slipping into homes without warning, slaughtering entire families. And still, many asked the same haunting question. How had this man slipped through the cracks? Doctors had known he was dangerous. His history was documented. Yet here he was, standing trial for 6 brutal murders. Richard Chase's arrest didn't end the horror. It only raised new questions. Could someone so deeply delusional even comprehend what he had done? Would he be locked away forever, or would his mental illness allow him to escape true punishment? The public wanted blood, just as Chase had craved it. They wanted justice for Ambrose Griffin, for Teresa Wallen, for the Miroth family, and for little David. But Chase's defense would argue that he wasn't a calculating killer, but a man completely lost to insanity. And that set the stage for a trial that would horrify, polarize, and leave a lasting scar on California's history. But this was only the beginning. When Richard Chase finally sat in a courtroom, the world got its first real look at the man behind the headlines. Gaunt, pale, with a hollow stare, he looked less like a criminal mastermind and more like a shell of a human being. The press labeled him the Vampire of Sacramento. But what shocked observers most wasn't his appearance. It was the gruesome evidence that prosecutors laid before the jury. The trial began in 1979, and from the outset, it was clear this would not be an ordinary case. Chase faced 6 counts of murder, and the prosecution wasted no time painting a picture of pure horror. They described how he entered homes at random, how he killed without hesitation, how he mutilated and drank the blood of his victims. They presented photographs of the crime scenes so graphic that jurors visibly recoiled. They introduced the blender found in his apartment, crusted with blood and human tissue, alongside countless kitchen utensils stained from his rituals. The evidence was overwhelming, but the real battle was not about whether Chase committed the crimes. It was about whether he should be held criminally responsible for them. His defense attorneys argued that Chase was not sane when he killed. They pointed to his long history of paranoid schizophrenia, his delusions about his blood turning to dust, his repeated hospitalizations, and the fact that he had been released despite obvious signs of danger. They told the jury that Richard Chase didn't kill out of malice. He killed because his mind had fractured beyond repair. He believed he was dying, and in his twisted reality, blood was the only cure. But the prosecution countered with chilling clarity. They acknowledged his mental illness, but they argued he still knew what he was doing was wrong. The proof? Chase went out of his way to select unlocked homes, suggesting he understood the concept of breaking and entering. He covered his tracks, fled crime scenes, and attempted to evade capture. These, prosecutors insisted, were not the actions of a man completely detached from reality. They were the actions of a predator who chose his victims carefully, even if his motives were delusional. The jury listened to weeks of testimony, caught between pity for a man so clearly broken and horror at the carnage he caused. When deliberations finally began, the weight of 6 lives hung heavy. More than that, they found him legally sane at the time of the killings. The The courtroom buzzed with the outcome. Families of the victims wept, some with relief, others with lingering anguish. Sacramento residents breathed easier knowing he would never walk free again. But the final blow was still to come. The jury sentenced Richard Chase to death in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. For a city still reeling from the horror of his crimes, the punishment felt like justice. But inside prison walls, Chase's story took one last macabre turn. He didn't last long on death row. Inmates reportedly avoided him, unnerved by his erratic behavior and his reputation as a man who drank blood. Guards described him as withdrawn, shuffling through the prison with the same hollow-eyed stare that had haunted his trial. On December 26, 1980, just 2 years after his arrest, Richard Chase was found dead in his cell. He had overdosed on antidepressant medication that he had been hoarding. Some saw it as cowardice, an escape from the fate that awaited him. Others saw it as the inevitable end for a man who had been spiraling toward self-destruction his entire life. In the end, Richard Chase never faced the gas chamber. His life ended as it had been lived, haunted by mental illness, consumed by obsession, and leaving behind a trail of devastation. But the legacy of his crimes lingers. The case of the Vampire of Sacramento forced the public to confront disturbing questions. How many warning signs had been ignored? How many chances had the system missed to stop him before he escalated to murder? And most haunting of all, could it happen again? True crime experts often point to Chase's case as an example of the catastrophic consequences when severe mental illness goes untreated and unchecked. Neighbors, doctors, even law enforcement had all seen pieces of his decline, but no one had put the puzzle together until it was too late. Today, his name lives on in documentaries, books, and whispered retellings of California's darkest crimes. But beyond the macabre fascination, his story is a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always appear in the form of a calculated mastermind. Sometimes it looks like a hollow-eyed man wandering your neighborhood, checking if your door is unlocked. So the next time you walk into your home and shut the door behind you, ask yourself, did you remember to lock it? Because Richard Chase believed an unlocked door was an invitation. And if history has taught us anything, it's that monsters don't need permission to come inside. They only need an open door. And while the Vampire of Sacramento is long gone, his story lingers like a shadow, a reminder of the thin line between safety and nightmare. He drank his victims' blood. He mutilated their bodies. And in doing so, he etched his name forever into true crime history. Richard Chase was the Vampire of Sacramento. But before you click away, let's pause for a moment and really think about what this story means. Richard Chase was one of the most disturbing killers America has ever seen. Not because he was cunning, not because he outsmarted detectives, but because he was so utterly broken and yet still managed to slip through the cracks. And that's the truly terrifying part. We often imagine monsters as people who hide in shadows, plotting in secret, masterminds of manipulation. But Chase wasn't clever. He was sloppy. He was unstable. He was walking the streets of Sacramento looking like death itself. And still, he killed 6 innocent people in less than a month. If someone like him could operate undetected, even briefly, what does that say about the dangers we don't see until it's too late? Think about the victims. Ambrose Griffin, a father gunned down in his driveway while unloading groceries with his wife. A completely random act that shattered a family forever. Teresa Wallen, young, pregnant, doing chores in her own home when death walked through an unlocked door. The Miroth family, 3 generations destroyed in a single afternoon, a massacre so brutal that even seasoned detectives had nightmares after seeing the crime scene. And baby David, only 22 months old, stolen from his crib and subjected to a fate too horrific to put into words. Each name is more than just part of a headline. Each one was a life with memories, families, futures that were stolen in a way that defies comprehension. And yet, society remembers Richard Chase more than it remembers them. His nickname, the Vampire of Sacramento, has become folklore in true crime. But the real story should always circle back to the people who lost everything because the world could not stop a man in time. Chase's crimes also expose something most people don't like to talk about: the intersection between untreated mental illness and violence. Now let's be clear. Most people who suffer from schizophrenia, delusions, or paranoia will never harm anyone. But Chase was different. His illness was extreme. His delusions fed by isolation, drug abuse, and a complete lack of structure. He was institutionalized, yes, but released far too early. He displayed every red flag imaginable, and still, the system failed to protect both him and the people around him. It is a sobering reminder of how mental health care isn't just about helping those who are suffering. It is also about keeping communities safe. Another haunting piece of his story is how ordinary the setup was. A quiet Sacramento neighborhood, houses with white picket fences, parents tucking their children into bed. And yet inside those same streets, a vampire was hunting, waiting for a door to be left unlocked. It's the banality of it that chills the most. Evil didn't arrive in a black cloak. It didn't announce itself. It walked barefoot down a suburban street and turned the most normal of homes into crime scenes that still shock us decades later. And that's why Chase's case continues to live on in true crime culture. He wasn't just a killer. He was a walking embodiment of every nightmare about vulnerability, about how thin the line is between safety and chaos, between normal life and tragedy. So as we close this story, ask yourself, why do we keep coming back to tales like this? Is it fear, morbid curiosity, or is it because on some level, we hope that by studying monsters, we'll recognize the signs before the next one appears? If you're still here right now, listening all the way to the end, you're part of the rare group who can stomach this story. And maybe that's because you understand that remembering these victims and understanding how killers like Chase come to be is the only way to stop history from repeating itself. Richard Chase drank blood. He believed it was the only way to survive. But in truth, all he did was spread death, fear, and heartbreak. He ended 6 lives. He terrified a city. And in the end, he destroyed himself. The Vampire of Sacramento may be gone, but the shadow he cast lingers. Every locked door, every glance into a darkened street, every news story about untreated illness or random violence, it all echoes back to the same chilling reminder. Monsters aren't myths. They live among us. And sometimes they don't need to hide in the dark. Sometimes they're already inside.